before we come to the general discussion about all these three presentations, are there any questions of clarification for the last presentation?
No?
No? Okay, then feel free. Oh, there, maybe. Well, then we just start the round of discussions with the presentation there. If the micro could go to this place there. We will collect some questions and then open the discussion.
Thank you. A question of clarification to Mr. Schularick. What would be your definition of populism? And maybe why did you put Bernie Sanders on the same picture? And the link with democracy is unclear to me. Like, I think many non-populist governments are not democratic or behave non-democratically. Like the neoliberal agenda is a fake democracy, and it's not considered populism. And a question of clarification as well to Mr. Milanovic. I really didn't understand the point on migration. Like you said, don't kill migration, but make it reduce the rights of the migrants. Or I don't understand your point.
Okay, then we have here someone on the right hand side, and then again behind. There's a lady at the back.
Luis Carlos Bresser Pereira from Getúlio Vargas Foundation. I have a question for Barbara and a question for Moritz, both on populism. My understanding of populism in economy is to expand above what you should do. Be responsible when you get in debt. There is a classical concept of populism in political science. And there is this very strange concept of populism that is being used today. This will be the question to Moritz. We are here in a heterodox convention, but we accept this concept of populism, that everything that is against economic liberalism is populism. This is the question for Moritz. This is your view. As to Barbara, look, you made a very interesting presentation about the hierarchies of money. And you show that the countries that get indebted in foreign money are in bad situation. Well, what we do, what the conventional economics makes is to say that governments are populist when they got in fiscal deficits, irresponsibly, not counter-cyclical, but irresponsibly, right? Without discipline. Okay, why not to call also populist in this economic sense, responsibility in exchange rate terms? Why not to call these current account deficits irresponsibility? And I would say, for my friend Germans, this enormous current account surplus, also the irresponsibility.
Okay, then, yeah, please introduce yourself.
I'm
and
Hanna Szymborska, PhD student at the University of
Speak
Leeds.
up, please.
I have a question to Branko about the relationship between within-country inequality and between-country inequality. Do you think that rising within-country inequality can reverse the decline in between-country inequality and even increase it in the future? Thank you.
Okay, then I have Yayati Ghosh on the list, and then afterwards you and you.
Thank you, Jayati Ghosh from New Delhi, and thank you for a really stimulating panel. First question to Barbara. You know, Barbara, there's this sort of long-run secular tendency for nominal depreciation of exchange rates for most developing countries over the past half-century. And they happen to be also the ones that have not converged, as you've mentioned. So what's the causation? How does it work? why does this happen and what is the causation? Is it related to the movement, as you showed, from the lower left quadrant to the upper right quadrant in terms of regulation? Or is it really because of lack of convergence that they are also nominally depreciating over the past 50 years or so? Question to Branko, this elephant graph, what does it look like at market exchange rates? Is it the same? Is it, what's the shape, basically? Yeah? Thank you.
Okay, then we have two here in the front. Yeah, I've seen you. Maybe you're the...
Should we reply at some point?
I think we just take you and then we make a first round of...
Thank you for your presentations. I have one question. My name is Mateus. I have one question for Ms. Fritz. You are talking about that it is structurally impossible that all the developing countries climb the ladder at the same time. So I would like to know your opinion about South-South cooperation and how to deal with it.
Okay, maybe we start with the first round of answers. No, keep it because your neighbor also wanted it. But that would be then after the first round of answers. And maybe we start in reverse order of the presentations.
Oh, that would be, okay, yeah. Okay, many excellent questions, and let me just make 2 points. So why is Bernie on there? Well, I thought I'd sneak him in because I know it would be controversial. What is populism? Is the question that is underlying, and that is clearly not. If you think about the Latin American experience, clearly not a term that's reserved for the right. There's left-wing populism as well as right-wing populism. The various definitions circling around. The one we've used is the one that I think is consensus in the political science literature. Without being a political scientist, so I'm like making claims about consensus in fields that I don't know much about. But which is that populism is mainly, it's a style. It's a political style where people pretend or claim to speak in the name of the common ordinary people against the elites. That's also the definition that Danny Roderick and others use quite prominently. So it's sort of an us and them, us the real people, us the normal people versus the corrupt elites. And the common theme is the unifying feature is really this anti-elitism. And now we can debate over drinks or dinner tonight whether to what degree Bernie then should be seen as a left-wing populist. It doesn't mean that he's as bad as anyone as the guys on the other side, but there's certainly an element of that definition of sort of a political style that emphasizes the to speak for the real people against the elites. Very briefly, I think we need to update, or that was your question, we need to update our thinking about populists. There's the Dornbusch-Edwards story about populism in Latin America, which is they come to office, they do unsustainable macro policies that all results in large budget deficits, inflation, and devaluations, and it doesn't work. That's the 1980s story. Look from Dornbusch and Edwards looking at Latin American populism, 50s, 60s, and 70s. That's not what's happening anymore. If you look at Orban, if you look at Berlusconi, if you look at Trump, there's a different form of populism that has emerged. These guys are following. It would be too far, but these guys are following relatively orthodox policies. And that also explains partly why the market doesn't reacts the way it does. So there's something new, but at the very same time, they undermine the political foundations of democracy.
Okay, my turn. First, if I can make a joke, I think that populism is really democracy that we don't like. Okay. I think it's a very good definition,
But don't like for a reason.
Okay, now on migration, I'll be brief actually. I just want to put it down because it's a controversial part, and I just want to make you aware that there isn't a controversial part. But I didn't have a time, nor will I have a time to explain it now. But the argument was following. If you take a very cosmopolitan point of view, that freedom of movement should be greater than it is now, and that it should lead for all people who migrate eventually to citizenship, to the same rights as domestic population have. I think it's actually the view that I'm very sympathetic with. But the problem with that view is that it might lead to really tightening of migration on the recipient side. So in other words, recipient countries might say, no, we don't want people who are going to get all the rights that we have. We want actually to keep certain rights for ourselves, and we don't want to share them with migrants. Then the danger of that is that you end up in a situation which I think is suboptimal for everybody, is that you really have an insufficient number of migrants. So my idea is essentially to say there is a trade-off. The more rights you give to the migrants, the less willing is domestic population to accept them. If you agree with me that there is a negative relationship, then the optimal position is somewhere on that relationship where the migrants do not have all the rights that local domestic population has. So that's the basic idea on migration. Now, the second question, can within national inequality actually offset and overturn the decline in global inequality coming from convergence? Technically, it is possible. The requirements for that, actually, people have done some simulations, are very strong now, because the importance of between country component or differences between the countries is so large that that as they shrink, they're really shrinking the bigger portion of the overall global inequality. So you would really need to have very substantive, I think actually they came with a number of, I think, 7 or 8 Gini points on average of within national inequality to go up in order to offset it. So I think, yes, it is possible. I don't think it's very likely, but it's also true that if there is a convergence together with rising within national inequalities, that gray component in my graph will grow, and this will become maybe a dominant salient point, or the dominant cleavage is between the rich and the poor, well, relatively poor in each individual country. The elephant graph, it looks more or less the same. I cannot remember the details, but it always, the pattern of that elephant graph. And there are people who attack the graph as saying, okay, you pull this country out or whatever. The essential point is very simple. We have 3 points. One point is around the middle, where actually you had high growth rates in Asian countries. Another point is very obvious. You did not have high growth rate among the poorer parts of the rich part distribution. And the third point is very obvious. The top 1% did well. So, no amount of playing is going to make these 3 points disappear. But one interesting thing just to add is I did the same graph with much worse data, but for the period 1970 to 1988. And what is interesting there, it's basically flat. Global income distribution didn't change. Everybody gained about the same. So here you have this distinct shape like that, and there you have a shape which is really basically like this. So that's a really major change, in the current period compared to what it was before.
Okay, many thanks to great questions. First, to Bressa Pereira's question and the issue of populism, which is a big topic Moritz brought in. I think I share your criticism. I think political sciences have a much easier task to define what is populism than economists, because it's very difficult to describe a precise set of policies as populist, and you can find all kinds of economic policies which are realized by populist governments, regimes, whatever. So I really feel not well and comfortable to use this term for economic policies. For example, in Latin America, a very long time this has been used as a critique to leftist, interventionist, whatever policies, which often had done a great job in creating growth, while other policies which have been seen from the 90s on as standard, good policies, created extremely unsustainable situations and were popular, and maybe you can call them populist, because they raised the perception of income earning, of purchasing power of a majority of a population of voters. So I don't really know what I should call populist as an economist, a populist policy. and there's certainly a possibility to do populist exchange rate policies by maintaining for a certain period of time the exchange rate rather appreciated because it makes imported goods very cheap and credit in US dollar perfect. And then the bust comes and the crisis comes. So this is populism. The German current account surplus, if I got you right, I never thought in perceiving it as populist, but certainly it is something very disruptive in terms of regional cooperation and of regional balancing, of global balancing. It is not seen as populist here in Germany in the public debate, but rather as an engine of growth, so maybe in a broader sense you can call it. Okay. Yati, your question about the depreciation of currencies over the last 15 years. Maybe I'm too much linked to the analysis of Latin American countries. What you can observe there is that in the last 15, 20 years, you had extremely strong cycles in terms of appreciation and depreciation of currencies. So what you can observe in many countries, it's very strong, an increase in terms of volatility of the exchange rate. This I would link to the global regime.
But there is a general secular decline.
Yes.
50 years, not 50.
50, okay. Well, yes, then I will argue for the 50 years, if I've got that an increasing financial globalization or increasing, the leaving of a fixed exchange rate regime and a global regime going towards financial liberalization, yes, strengthens the pressure on exchange rates and may lead to a general trend of depreciation, but with strong volatility. Okay, last question, South-South cooperation. I have done work on that with a series of co-authors because it would be the logical consequence to try to increase the space of currencies of southern economies by joining them. Well, the first point is that the size effect would have to be rather large. So rather large southern economies would have to join to make an effect in terms of size. China now is changing the picture, as we know from Branko, also in monetary and financial issues. Second, seeing the mess in the euro area, there have been many attempts for South-South monetary and financial cooperation and integration, which are quite interesting in all parts of the world. Africa the least, but Latin America and Asia, there are intensive attempts and institution building, etc. But the euro crisis has put some sand in the wheel of the idea of regional also monetary cooperation, because it has shown that first the requirements for cooperation are very high, and second there's an inclination towards a more strict standard orthodox policy set when you cooperate. Okay, but still there is relevant institution building and elements like, for example, liquidity pooling at the regional level of South-South. And I've done an empirical study on that, and it shows that it's very important for small southern countries to be part of regional liquidity pooling to get access to liquidity at the regional level in times of financial distress. But for middle and for middle and bigger economies, it's difficult to find a sufficient solution here. And what we find is that there has been strong efforts in terms of institutional building at the regional South-South level, but what we see in the last 10 years is a deinstitutionalization of these regional mechanisms by the building up of bilateral mechanisms, and here again China being the main driver of this. So, thank you.
Okay, thank you. I have 3 more people on the list. Gentleman here in the front, then a gentleman at the back, and then Andy, and then I saw more people raising hands. That's too much for the next round. 1, 2, 3. Okay, so we first start, and then you have to raise your hands again, I'm afraid. First, you, yeah.
That would be a question for Mr. Milanovic and Schularick about the populism you were talking about again. like, this is a term personally I don't like because it covers different realities and actually hides some real parts of the political process. And for instance, you put Marine Le Pen on the on your actually amount of images, and there's, I think, a very specific thing about France here. Weighing two things is that it's part of the European Union, it's considered as a pillar of it, and like a presidential, it's a country that has a big presidential power. So would, in your analysis, a possible arrival to power of these, of this party, for instance, the Front National, which is gaining more and more power, not getting to power because of France's political institutions are really specific, but wouldn't like the getting to power of such a party have different consequences in the, like, for instance, institutional consequences concerning the flow of capital around the world and the currency system, for instance, different than that of Trump or other countries?
Okay, thank you. The gentleman in the back.
Yeah, hello. Rafael Wilder, Greenwich University. 3 questions, but they are all very short. The first one is to Mr. Milanovic. You elaborated already on your, let's call it, citizenship light idea. What would be, in your way, the 2 next most important policies in order to manage that kind of transition, which we are seeing smoothly? The other 2 questions to Mr. Schularick. The first one, I was quite puzzled that you didn't include financial deregulation in the sense of off-balance sheet vehicles as a kind of mechanism to sidestep capital requirement regulations. Up there, when you talked about reasons for financial crisis, do you include that in or was that implicitly included in the capital view? And the second one, I think the results you presented about financial crisis and political backlash, that was quite interesting. I was asking myself whether it's really financial crisis or is it something else which might be closely related, income inequality, in the sense of, do people really care about whether the banks go bust, or do they care about whether when they lose their jobs? And a small sub one, when you said that you didn't find any effects for similar events which were not financial crisis, is that really because people care more about losing the job due to a bank crash, or is it that there is not enough volatility in the data about these crises that you didn't find anything there? Thank you.
Andy, you can.
Andy Watt from the IMK. My question's to Branko Milanovic. Branko, you talked about the China effect, and you noted the fact that China is or will soon be close to the median global income, and you said that means that the depressing effect on global inequality is coming to an end from that point of view. So there's an obvious reverse question to that is, will the depressing effect from China on working class, on lower middle class wages in the advanced countries, is that also going to come to an end from China? And if it is, will it just go on, continue on because it's going to just be taken up by other countries? Or is it possible that that effect is just generally going to come to an end, or at least ease, which of course would politically would without policy changes, would take some of the pressure off, let's say, the centre-left parties in the advanced countries?
Okay, there was someone right behind. Yeah, maybe you can just directly use the micro. Thanks. Okay, maybe next round.
Hi, I'm Pedro. I have a question for Professor Barbara Fritz. And so you were speaking about the strategy of climbing the ladder and more broadly for development. And it looks like a competitive exchange rates, and it looks like export-led strategies in a sense. So I'll have like 2 related questions. First, there is no possibility then for like a sustainable strategy that is more inward-looking and not so outward-looking, as since we saw that there's all of these problems of globalization. And the second unrelated question would be that if this is only one strategy that's really sustainable, it wouldn't be paradoxically better to propose and we have like a big hegemon that can run in very large current account deficits that would open space for several countries to pursue this export-led strategy? Thank you.
Okay, yeah, I think we have a problem now. We have still 2 gentlemen on the list, you and Hans-Jörg Herr here in the first row. And I know there were more people wanting to say something, but we have to...
Yes, I have 2 questions. One for Professor Schularick. I want to know if he, in his research, he has tried also to, instead of clustering all political parties are considered populist, to differentiate between left-wing parties and right-wing parties, because I think that left-wing parties have similar political, economic policies, and right-wing parties, maybe apart the Polish one, has also similar economic policies. The first more reducing inequality, and the right-wing more reducing immigration. And I think the results could be interesting. And for Professor Barbara Fritz, I would be interested to know, she had said that developing countries cannot pursue inflation targeting because they have to fix the exchange rate or to control the exchange rate. I would want to know if maybe it's possible through other channels, for example, the control of credit creation, control of the credit sector is possible to try to control inflation for developing countries.
Thanks. Can you just repeat the word of what
trade sector? You mean
credit, yeah.
Okay, good.
Two questions to Branko. First one, you did not mention Latin America, and Latin America does not seem to be in the
Barbara
best,
did, so
the
we
best.
agree.
The second point is, obviously, as you have mentioned, the new development is that one region now really is catching up, and it's basically China, probably South Korea, Taiwan, and maybe some other countries. When we look at these countries, they don't really fit to the globalization model. They have heavy government interventions, partly heavy capital controls. What is your judgment that exactly the group of countries not following, so to speak, the Washington consensus policies or the neoliberal policies, that these are the most successful ones? Do you have any judgment about that?
Okay, thank you. I think this will be now the last round. I'm sorry, I've seen many more people wanting to say something, but I think we have to finish on time if the organizers do not give me a different signal. So this will be the last opportunity for you, and I think we then again use the order of the presentation. So Barbara will start, and then.
Okay. Very brief to leave you to dinner, all of us. Okay. Yes, you could translate that as a kind of export-led strategy, but based on other arguments. Inward-looking strategies we have, together with the same author, Daniela Prates and Luis Fernando de Paula, we have analyzed scrutinally inward-looking strategies combining growth with redistribution and technological change, which have spread as an idea over the last decade in Latin America. And we have found that it's rather difficult to make compatible the idea of maintenance of achievement and maintenance of a competitive exchange rate with inward-looking strategies, especially when you work with the instrument of increasing wages. I think this is really a field of research which deserves a much more attentive kind of looking into. But we were rather skeptical after looking into the new ideas. Would it be better to have a hegemon with the current account deficit? And of course, this would stabilize the position better of the countries at the bottom of the currency pyramid, certainly. But the first best global regime would be a kind of a Keynes plan to balance debtors and creditors. Of course, this is an idealistic dream, but this would be a solution of really ending up with this kind of hierarchy. Okay, inflation targeting. Of course, there are other manners of achieving low inflation and competitive exchange rate, but the instrument of inflation targeting per se is thought as one where you let fluctuate the exchange rate just to make the channel from the exchange rate to the price level more effective. So that's why we think you shouldn't even call it like that, to be clear. Okay, thank you.
Okay, I will also try to be brief. I actually, let me start with the first question about things to do. Well, this is going to be really brief. I like your term, actually, the citizenship light. So that's one thing. I actually have three things which are, I believe, important. One is the citizenship light. The second one is reduction of concentration or deconcentration of capital ownership. You know, the number that I showed you there with the Gini of 90 and plus, which I think can be achieved slowly, but it can be achieved by giving much greater tax advantages to the middle class to hold capital assets in general, and actually withdrawing an incredible amount of advantages and loopholes that were given to the rich, of which I have, I think, examples on a daily basis. And also reviving again the employee stock ownership plan and other things which would actually increase what Margaret Thatcher called people's capitalism, but it was quite forgotten actually. Not that she probably cared, but she at least gave the name. And then the third one is about education. Now that everybody speaks about education, but in this case I really think that the key problem is that we now have more and more people, and actually there are US data which show that, who are both large capital recipients of large capital income and have very high labor income. So we have people who are in the top 10% by labor, and the same people are in top 10% by capital. So it is what I call in my new book the new capitalism, because we didn't have that in the past. And I think that the danger of that is, first, it looks somewhat meritocratic, so it is meritocratic, so it's more difficult to tax. But the danger of that is that intergenerationally, these advantages are going to be transmitted to the children. And this is what we see in the US with really inaccessible public education, which then gives you really very high rents. Because essentially what they do give you, they're really giving you very high rents. You just have to have enough money to go to that school. And then you have, once you're in the school, you graduate, because that's kind of 99% of people graduate regardless of what they do. And then you have a large rent. So it's a system which I think, and that's why I think Bernie's idea of actually having public education being much stronger and be at the center is, I think, a very valuable idea because it would break that particular vicious or virtuous, for some people, cycle. On the China, well, can I just say one more thing, actually? It is on this, the effect, actually, what is behind the results, which I find actually quite fascinating, Morris's result, could be also inequality. Mm-hmm. And we're planning to release that paper, because tomorrow is the 99th anniversary of the armistice. Mm-hmm. So we are planning to release a paper which looks at what I call the endogenous theory of World War I. But let me just tell you three things that we find. Is that the countries with higher inequality, there's not too many countries, we're talking about 4 countries or 5. Countries with higher inequality had higher net foreign assets. Net foreign assets were predominantly by far held by the rich groups of those countries. And thirdly, countries with large net foreign assets compared to the GDP had more military. So basically, I think this is how inequality leads to certain steps which favor militarization. That doesn't explain the war, but it says favoring militarization. On the China effect, yeah, I totally agree with you, because there is really sort of a trade-off. Ironically or paradoxically, whatever, is that actually what is hurting the middle classes in the rich world is apparently something which is really helping the emergence of the global middle class. So I totally agree, without repeating, everybody has heard that the China effect, as it wanes globally, might actually release the pressure on the middle class in the West. But I think, on the other hand, that behind China, we have many other countries, as you actually alluded. We have India, we have Indonesia, we have Vietnam, we have Burma, which is now growing, we have Ethiopia. So I'm not quite sure that that effect would be really gone in the next 2 or 3 decades. Excuse me. I've got. Yeah. It seems that Teresa is affecting everybody.
Everywhere. So yeah, let me also be brief with the few last words. Look, I think like one of the main purposes that like a talk thank you, that a talk can give is like give you food for thought. And I think like I'm trying to quantify a phenomenon like populism is exactly that, and it makes us think about what are the underlying processes. What does it mean? Like as Branko said, it is true. There's even a definition of populism, which is populism is the awkward dinner guest of democracies. It's like it's the democracy that we don't like, and there's like the don't like aspect, and I think that's important for the definition, at least that political scientists use, is the rejection of the established institutions of democracy. Right? There's always the claim there's something wrong with the way democracy is working. It's not working for the people, it's working for the elites in Wall Street, in wherever. This anti-establishment rejection notice, I think, is very strong. And that brings me to the point that Barbara has. I think it would be like as a research strategy, we really wanted to say like, okay, let's take the definition from the political scientist and apply that as objectively as we can. Making us think about things as left and right populism, which was a question. You described that in a way that they're so different in their policies. I remind you there's things like National Socialism where kind of the two extremes meet. No, I mean there is an element of if you think about sort of the emphasis on national protectionism, anti-immigration, and combining that sort of with policies to strengthen that sort of basing that on a xenophobic note. So there's variations of definitions, and I think it's good not to shut down, but to think about where these go. I think it would be problematic to classify populism by policies, Barbara, because that's like, we can't say like the bad policies are the populist, so they're bad, and the good policies are not populist, so they're good. I mean, that can't be a research strategy. So I take all your comments on board about like let's try to be like as scientific as we can about finding definitions. Let me give you one comparison, which I think is illuminating, which is uncertainty. Uncertainty is a big theme now in macroeconomics. Finally, you might say the profession has woken up to it, and then people started trying to measure uncertainty. And then people came up with implied stock market volatility. They came up with indices of policy uncertainty. They came up with all kinds of tries to quantify a very fundamental and important concept. I think everyone here in the room agrees that sort of uncertainty is really important for we had a lot of Keynes before for the macroeconomy. But if we want to do something, we have to quantify it. And then all these attempts to quantify, to define will be imperfect, but that's how the debate evolves. So maybe the definition that political scientists use for populism so far as this political anti-establishment style that, claims to speak in the name of the ordinary people that are no longer represented in the political process and the rejection of the existing institutions. Maybe that's imperfect, and let's try to find a better and newer one.
Okay, thank you very much, especially you all.
Very interesting stuff that you have.